You see, something's going to happen.
What? What's going to happen?
Something wonderful.
What?
I understand how you feel. You see, it's all very clear to me now.
Welcome to the Occult Rejects. In this episode, I got myself and I got the mad scientist Occult Reject Lisa with me. We will be covering Empedocles. And if you enjoy this episode, we're sure you will enjoy more content like this on the Occult Rejects. In fact, we have a curated playlist on occult topics like grimoires, esoteric concepts and phenomena, occult history, analyzing true crime and cults with an occult lens, parapolitics, and occultism in music. Whether you enjoy consuming your content visually or via audio, we've got you covered. And will always be free of charge. So if you enjoy what we do and want to support our work of providing accessible free content on various platforms, please consider making a donation to the links provided below. And to give you an idea of what goes into maintaining the Occult Rejects, it costs around $1,500 to $2,000 each year to run and host the podcast. StreamYard is about $800, the website is about $200, and Spreaker is about another $500, not including equipment or the hours spent researching, recording, and editing content for each episode. If you're considering supporting our work, please do so on Cash App, Venmo, Patreon, or Buy Me a Coffee. Thank you and enjoy the episode. And now I will hand it over to Lisa.
So when we started looking at occultists and scientists of the ancient and historical world, we noticed that some of the most influential ones were inspired by Empedocles. In fact, some of these highly regarded occultist, scientists, philosophers, you name it, like Kepler, Galen, Aristotle, Plato, all of their impactful theories stemmed from theories that were first brought to light by Empedocles.
Also, Empedocles was the first to talk about how the eyes worked. He was also the first, if not the only one at the time, who made the analogy between the eyes and Aphrodite. As well, what we see being the result of vision originating within and projecting outward. After looking into his work, we noticed how influential he seemed to be in Crowley's work, which we will touch on as well. And here I just wanted to include at the beginning a quote by him that I really liked. Nourished in the seas of back springing blood, where above all is located what humans call thought. For the blood around the heart is for humans their thought. Empedocles was a Greek pre-Socratic philosopher from Acragas, a Greek city located in the region of Sicily. His contributions to philosophy are particularly well known for originating the influential Cosmogony. Screwed it up again. How do you say that word? Cosmogonic theory of the four classical elements. For those who may not be familiar with the term cosmogony, if I said that wrong, right? It refers to any theoretical model or explanation concerning the origin and development of the cosmos or the universe as a whole. The classical elements, according to Empedocles, typically refer to the elements used in witchcraft and occultism today: earth, water, air, and fire, which he believed were the building blocks of all matter. He referred to them as the four roots, indicating their fundamental nature. Additionally, Empedocles undertook experiments that led him to assert, at least to his own liking, that air was indeed a distinct substance. He made this observation through a very simple demonstration. When a bucket was inverted in water, it did not fill completely with water, as a pocket of air remained trapped inside, illustrating that air occupies space and exists separately from water. Empedocles was the first philosopher to propose the concept of the four classical elements as a cohesive set: fire, earth, air, and water. Empedocles was well known for his philosophical stance against the practice of animal sacrifice, as well as the killing of animals for the purpose of food consumption. He also had a distinctive doctrine of reincarnation, which was quite unique for his time. He is generally regarded as the last Greek philosopher who chose to record his profound ideas in verse form, which was rather different for the times. Luckily, a portion of his work survived, offering some insights into his thinking.
So, if I may, we're going to take you on a little tangent of this whole thing about verse. So, bear with us. But I think it's extremely important and it ties in really, really interestingly. Okay, so I want to expand a little bit more on the style of writing in terms of delivering it in the verse form. Empedocles, during the 5th century BCE, wrote his philosophical programs and ideas in hexameter verse. This would include his most influential 4-part theory of roots and love and strife principles, which is going to go on to be highly influential and pretty much foundational to philosophy, mysticism, medicine, cosmology, and religion. He also wrote in verse form for his work on purifications, which was Empedocles' poem of ritual cleansing, which was also written in hexameter verse, and also transmigration, in which this hexameter verse form gives such a spectacular effect to what Empedocles' equation of ritual animal sacrifice to human sacrifice was like. Something familiar to Agamemnon's slaughter of Iphigenia. I probably didn't say that right, but something like that. So hexameter. Kind of break it down. I'm sure most of y'all are familiar with it, but kind of, bear with us. So hexameter is a line of verse consisting of 6 metrical feet. So you have a metrical line of verses consisting of 6 feet or foot or pulse. It's going to differ from the iambic pentameter, which is 5 iambs versus 6. So English poetry from Geoffrey Chaucer, is that how you say it? Chaucer?
Yeah, I think so.
Introduced iambic pentameter to the English language in the 14th century. William Shakespeare, John Milton of Paradise Lost were all well-known poets who used iambic pentameter, as well as Percy Bysshe Shelley, and even Jim Morrison was also known to use iambic pentameter in his songs. So hexameter had been tried in the English poetry, but it really never took off, only because it was hard to adapt the hexameter rhythm to the English language. So it's a little bit difficult, and that's why the popularity never gained. Poetry in and of itself flows from syllable to syllable, each pair of syllables creating a pattern known as a poetic meter. When a verse line is made up of 2 syllables flowing from one unaccented beat to an accented beat, it creates a rhythmic pattern called iambic meter. So the term iambic originally was applied to the quantitative meter in classical poetry. Meters in English were accentual syllabic verse, whereas ancient Greek and Latin meter was a rhythm created through the use of alternating short and long syllables. You also see this in Vedic and Sanskrit, in that they are said to also utilize this rhythmic pattern, meter, or form of it in their written stuff. So when you have a pair of syllables and they're arranged in a short followed by a long or unstressed followed by a stress pattern, you now have a iambic or foot type of cadence. Okay, so why all this? So hexameter is the oldest form known in Greek poetry. It was the standard epic meter in classical Greek and Latin literature. So we have the Iliad, the Odyssey, hymns of Orpheus, and so forth. Where it gets interesting is that according to mythology in Greece, hexameter was invented by Phenomenon, I think that's how you say it, who was a daughter of Apollo and the first Pythia of Delphi. This was around 500, 300 BC, or give or take. So the Oracle of Delphi delivered her prophecies in the form of dactylic hexameter verse. The priest would then translate the utterances of the Pythia, or the oracle herself, into this metrical pattern of Greek poetry consisting of lines with 6 feet. The hexameter verse were deliberately ambiguous, requiring careful interpretation by the recipient, who could only understand the true meaning of the prophecy. The practice of delivering prophecies in hexameter verse was a key aspect to ancient Greek Oracle of Delphi, which was extremely important to the rituals in their culture and therefore highlighting the importance of the poetic language. Now, one of the main things that we found that I thought was very symbolic to add is that it was said that if prophecies were not given in hexameter verse, then they were regarded as potentially not authentic. So this is where you get hexameter verse as being extremely paramount to the utterances of the divine to the regular people. So it is said that Empedocles wrote his responses, even those like to Parmenides, in hexameter, whether it was a response to what he had claimed or other things.
It's interesting. And, you know, iambic got me thinking of I am, or Crowley's lamb. And if prophecies or words relayed by supernatural beings came in the form of verse, hexameter, iambic, then we hypothesize that possibly all words from beyond have a similar pattern. Could it be possible that the words of Iowas or lamb also be in verse pattern? And would it be possible that Crowley, considering himself the beast of revelation, something beyond the natural, could he be so bold, as he likes to be, as to write his poems in hexameter verse? You know, and if Empedocles wrote his poems, which were to be used during rituals in a hexameter verse, would it be out of like the realm of possibility that poems Crowley wrote, which were to also be used during rituals, also be written in metered verse? And say, you know, the hexagram rituals are supposed to be used with poems written in hexameter verse, and could the pentagram rituals in poems written in would they be written in iambic pentameter? You know, there's something to think about, because even when it comes to rituals, for me in the OTO, and really for any other kind of secret society that's based on like the Kabbalah or ceremonial magic, you're going to have the pentagram and the hexagram ritual are going to be very, very big rituals to use. And you know, I just wonder if there's a correlation between that and that style of writing.
Mm-hmm. Plus, it was used throughout, like with Vedic and Greek and all that stuff.
Yeah. And again, like what you had said, especially with the pentameter. I mean, if that's how they were deciphering something, you know, being worth to listen to, I find that very interesting.
And like, remember during this time, the philosophers, mathematicians, and poets like Empedocles, they were still using alphanumerical language. And so if it was an ancient Greek culture and poetry in their rituals was extremely important, I think it begs the question, did metered verse poetry serve as a code? Or did it serve as a way to give power or energy to the words in the poems used during these rituals?
Yeah, I would question even another cipher to toss onto it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now we're going to talk a little bit of his life and death. While the exact dates of Empedocles' birth and death are unknown, most agree that he was born in the early 5th century BC in the Greek city of Acragas, present-day Sicily. Modern scholars believe the accuracy of the accounts that he came from a noble family. Sources point to him as the son of a certain Meton, which is a Greek mathematician, and therefore born into an important and wealthy local aristocratic family. How convenient. It is said that his godfather, also named Empedocles, had been victorious in a horse race at the Olympia in the 71st Olympiad.
So many texts do state that his grandfather was extremely wealthy. He kept horses and was well remembered as a victor in the Olympic Games. And so you see games as being plural, like you almost wonder if he was something of a consistent contributor to these games. This claim also agrees with the historical context of the area at that time. Acragas was the southern central Sicilian polis of modern day Agrigento. I think that's how you say it. For context, Arcus lies on the plateau surrounded by cliffs overlooking the two rivers, Drago and Arcus rivers. And to the north are a set of Twin Peaks, which of course reminds me of, Twin Peaks. Agrigento was a wealthy ancient city founded in 581 BCE, and it lies just northwest of Malta. During Empedocles' lifetime, Arcus had gone from a tyrannical reign to an oligarchy to the new governmental system of democracy. And considering that these contrasting but significant political transformations, it's nodded, or it's given a nod that Empedocles, from his writings, tended to lean more towards a democratic governing. It's also claimed that aside from being known as a philosopher, Empedocles was also known as a politician. He championed against tyranny. He also dismantled the oligarchy of the thousand being in quotation, because he rejected kingship. Also, Empedocles' father was also said to have forestalled rising tyranny. So you start to see that Empedocles, potentially from the paternal exposure, was potentially a talented orator and had his ties into politics.
Yeah, they do mention, and I think we might even bring it up in here, that he did have a lot of political writing. It's just unfortunately they can't seem to find it anymore. It's been destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
Primary sources of information on the life of Empedocles come from the Hellenistic period, several centuries after his own death and long after any reliable evidence about his life would have been lost, destroyed, etc. Modern scholars generally believe that these biographical details, including his chronologically impossible tutelage under Pythagoras and his employment as a doctor and miracle worker, were fabricated from interpretations of Empedocles' poetry, which does tend to happen a lot to the biographies written during this time.
I think one of the underlying trends that you'll find is a constant scholarly debate when looking into Empedocles. The details of his biography, as you mentioned, is one of a few at the very top of the list of this debate. For example, it is also said that Empedocles was a student of Parmenides of Elea and later associated with Anaxagoras and Pythagoras, which we'll discuss a little more later on in the episode. But my reason for bringing this up is that from the work that has survived and looking at it chronologically, it might be a bit of a stretch that for Empedocles to have personally met all three. However, with that being said, much of what has survived of Empedocles' work reflects that it was more than just him being familiar with their teachings. It strongly suggests that, and evidently points to, actual engagement with Parmenides and Anaxagoras and Pythagoras' theories. That's a hard one.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. I was just looking it up again and already forgot how to say Anaxagoras.
Thank you.
Yeah, because I was like, just in case I have to say that myself. According to Aristotle, Empedocles died at the age of 60. Some writers have him living up to the age of 109. There are myths concerning his death. A tradition which is traced to Heracles Ponticus represented him as having been removed from the earth, whereas others had him perishing in the flames of Mount Etna. He was also said to have died in Peloponnese, Greece, if I said that correctly.
So kind of going to expand a little bit of what you've said. There's a significant number of apocryphal stories collected during the time of Empedocles in antiquity, and most can be found in the book Lives of the Eminent Philosophers by Diogenes Laertius, which is regarded as one of the most detailed sources of Empedocles' life. So in addition to recording his claims of divine status and magical powers, the book goes at length into discussing the various accounts or stories of how Empedocles was said to have died. His death in particular seemed to have attracted so much attention, and there are many theories of how he died. Empedocles was said to have died in so many different ways. So like the first one was he drowned when he fell overboard from a ship. Another one was that he hung himself. A third was that he died after breaking his leg when he fell from a carriage. And then the one that he is the most famous for, which you just mentioned, and the source of the legend for Empedocles, was that Empedocles died by throwing himself into the crater of Mount Etna in Sicily. And it's claimed that Empedocles had learned that he was going to die, or the news of his imminent death was so great that he wanted to appear as though he wanted to die as though he had been hypothesized. So he leapt into the crater so that the people would believe his body had vanished and that he would then turn into an immortal god. The volcano, however, threw back out one of his trademark bronze sandals, revealing the deceit. So I thought that's pretty classic.
Yeah. Another legend says that he threw himself into the volcano to prove his disciples that he was immortal. He believed he would come back as a god after being consumed by the fire. Horace also refers to the tragic death of Empedocles in his work Ars Poetica. In Icaro Menippus, a comedic and thought-provoking dialogue written by the 2nd century satirist Lucian of Samosata, the final fate of Empedocles is reevaluated. Rather than being incinerated in the intense fires of Mount Etna, he is depicted as being carried up into the heavens by a volcanic eruption. In this retelling, Empedocles not only survives, but continues his existence on the moon, where he sustains himself by feeding on the nourished dew that collects there. Interesting.
Which is food for the moon, right?
Yeah,
that
food
y'all
for the
always
moon.
say.
Now, some of these things I do want to say, like I do wonder, obviously some of them sound like they could just be fantastical, and that could, literally be what it is, or could it be more occult, kind of stories? This is my opinion.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So while many scholars have dramatized him as a self-styled god, I kind of want to revisit what you said earlier and touch upon, or rather emphasize, that his contemporaries regarded him as indeed more than a mere mortal. So you have Aristotle writing about how he hailed him as the inventor of rhetoric. It is said that Empedocles' poetry rivaled that of Homer. Galen, who's well known for the discovery and description of the optic nerve, regarded him as a founder of Italian medicine. Lucretius held that Empedocles' hexameter poetry was one that you should hold in the highest of esteem, and he held it in highest esteem and admiration. Empedocles was the founder of the Sicilian School of Medicine and was claimed to be a great physician, and this is evidence conveyed in the Hippocratic's 5th century of the current era book on ancient medicine, and basically details a critique of Empedocles' alliance of the study of nature and medicine. And it is also said within this book itself that he was known to have brought a dead woman back to life.
It's impressive.
It's a long list.
Yeah. Based on the surviving fragments of his work, modern scholars generally believe that Empedocles was directly responding to Parmenides' doctrine of monism and was likely acquainted with the work of Anaxagoras. Philosophical monism is the belief that all of the sensible world is of one, basic substance and being, uncreated and indestructible. Anaxagoras was a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher who introduced the concept of nous, the cosmic mind, as an ordering force. He also gave several novel scientific accounts of natural phenomena, including the notion of panspermia, that life exists throughout the universe and could be distributed everywhere. He deduced a correct explanation for eclipses and described the sun as a fiery mass larger than Peloponnese, and also attempted to explain rainbows and meteors. I will have to say, isn't it kind of wild how, they were talking about this stuff back then or theorizing on it? I actually just find that interesting, that these ideas, that they were even ideas, because I don't even know how to say it, but, I do find it impressive, considering, I feel like what people think about today. Many later accounts of his life claim that Empedocles studied with the Pythagoreans on the basis of his doctrine of reincarnation, although he may have instead learned this from a local tradition rather than directly from the Pythagoreans. Now, a little bit on his writings and work. Most of Empedocles' work has not survived intact. There's only about 2 poems. The 2 poems on nature and on purifications. Together comprise a total of 5,000 lines. However, only about 550 lines of his poetry survived, quoted in fragments by later ancient sources. So that's unfortunate. Out of the 5,000 line thing, we have about 550 to work with.
10%.
Yeah.
10% of his work.
Like 10.5 or something like that. Yeah.
So to base, theories, you're basing your theory of Empedocles on 10% of his work.
Or it's when it was found, after they got raped and pillaged, was there only 10% left to show us? Wonder about that too.
So in the last 20 years, scholars have debated whether these 2 poems were part of one big philosophical project or if they were 2 separate works. It's been long held like a long held belief that these two poems are completely two separate pieces of work. And the reason for that is because the two topics are very distinct from each other. And as alleged by Diogenes, 3rd century of the current era biography in Empedocles. But an earlier publication, which was found dating back all the way to the 1st, 2nd century current era, surfaced and showed to contain lines of on purifications as part of the on nature work. So why does this matter? Because if these two poems were part of a single project, then the theory arises that the physical doctrine on purifications is not separate from the religious one, which was on nature, and that both themes are much more related than previously thought. Because that would mean that the history of the structure and formation of the physical world, animals and plants within it, have a lot to do with morality and purification, at least in terms of rituals or in terms of the way he was trying to describe it, that they were important enough to be inclusive. So of the surviving 550 lines of poetry, as depicted in older editions of Empedocles, about 450 lines were ascribed to On Nature, which outline his philosophical system and goes into explaining not only the nature and history of the universe, including his theory of the 4 classical elements, but also the theories on causation, perception, thought, as well as explanation of terrestrial phenomenon and biological processes. The other 100 lines of poetry, which have been typically ascribed to On Purifications, was taken to be a poem simply about ritual purification, and they contain all of his religious, moral, and ethical thought. So many early editors thought that it was a poem that offered a mythical account of the world based on Empedocles' philosophical system.
On Nature was written to address 3 audiences. The muse, Calliope, if I'm saying that correctly, makes an appeal to the divine for inspiration. Second one, his disciple Pausanias, if I'm saying that correctly, promising him mortal intelligence beyond all others, and it's in an attempt to cultivate the master-pupil relationship. And the third reason was for the community of Acragas. And it goes on to discuss metaphysics, or the study of the nature of being, and cosmogony, influenced by the coming together and separation of Empedocles' 4 basic elements via the forces of love and strife. Now, when we get into the elements with him, we will get into a little bit about about Empedocles and the elements, or as he called them, roots. And first I'll read some of his own stuff. And this is from fragment 17. Twofold is what I shall say, for at one time they, i.e. the elements, grew to be only one. Out of many, at another time again, they separate to be many out of one. And double is the birth of mortal things, double their death. For the one is both born and destroyed by the coming together of all things, while the other inversely, when they are separated, is nourished and flies apart. And these, the elements, incessantly exchange their places continually, sometimes by love all coming together into one, and sometimes again each one carried off by the hatred of strife. And adversely, the one separating again, they end up being many. To that extent they become, and they do not have a steadfast lifetime. But insofar as they incessantly exchange their places continually, to that extent they are always immobile in a circle. Empedocles established 4 elements which make all structures in the world: fire, air, water, and earth. Empedocles called these 4 elements roots, which he also identified with the mythical names of Zeus, Hera, Nestis, and Adonis. Now here the 4-fold roots of everything, enlivening Hera, Hades, shining Zeus, and Nestis, moistening mortal springs with tears. That was from him.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So while Empedocles never used the term element, Aristotle credits Empedocles with being the first to make a clear distinction of these 4 elements, which the word element may have first been used by Plato. think he used roots instead of elements, but it was Aristotle that he was saying that he's the one that basically came up with it. Also, it has been said that because Empedocles gave these roots names of the divine, it is claimed that he was implying that each of them had an active nature and not going to be, or not, they should not just be regarded as inert matter. One interpreter describes his philosophy as asserting that nothing new comes or can come into being. The only change that can occur is a change in the juxtaposition of element with element. This theory of the four elements became the standard dogma for the next 2,000 years. And so if you think about, nothing can come from nothing, it's essentially pretty much stating the first law of thermodynamics, where energy can neither be created nor destroyed. So it was pretty impactful, I think.
Yeah, that's impressive. According to Empedocles, the four elements are both brought into union and parted from one another by two divine powers, love and strife, Philotes and Nikos. One thing I do want to add, I do find it interesting, love does match I in gematria, and strife does match Sillery. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Love serves as the force responsible for the attraction and cohesion of different forms of what we now refer to as matter, while strife acts as the driving force behind their inevitable separation and division. If we consider that these four elements make up the entirety of the universe, then the interplay of love and strife provides a compelling explanation for the variation, diversity, and harmony observed within it. These two opposing forces can be understood as both attractive and repulsive, embodying the push and pull dynamics present in nature. As they interact, the relative dominance of love and strife waxes and wanes, creating a balance. However, it is important to note that neither force ever entirely escapes the influence or imposition of the other.
And that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind, was this balance that he tried to portray, as well as it was a waxing and waning. So when we refer to the waxing and waning as describing how love and strife influence the roots, it almost sounds analogous to the moon and how it also waxes and wanes and exerts its influence, especially over the water. Also, in Fragment 17, it is said to have a symmetry or balance to it. So you have birth and death, coming to be, passing away. It also describes the dominance of one force over the other, and then their exchanging of their places continuously, almost personifying like a cycle or the image of a cycle. So and also because of that cycle, you also picture a lack of finality or triumph over the other. There's just only moments of dominance with continued alteration.
A thought by Empedocles on that idea is there was a time when the pure elements and the two powers coexisted in a condition of rest and inertness in the form of a sphere. The elements existed together in their purity, without mixture and separation, and the uniting power of love predominated in the sphere. The separating power of strife guarded the extreme edges of the sphere. Since that time, strife gained more sway, and the bond which kept that pure elementary substances together in the sphere became dissolved. The elements became the world of phenomena we see today, full of contrast and oppositions, operated on by both love and strife. Empedocles assumed cyclical universe whereby the elements return and prepare the formation of the sphere for the next period of the universe. Empedocles also attempted to explain that separation of elements, the formation of earth and sea, of sun and moon, and of atmosphere. Empedocles argues that these roots and forces do not pass away, nor is anything added to them. According to him, for these are all equal and identical in age, but each one presides over a different honor. Each one has its own character, and by turns they dominate while the time revolves. And besides these, nothing at all is added nor is lacking. For if they perished entirely, they would no longer be. In this whole here, what could increase it, and coming from where? And how could it be completely destroyed, since nothing is empty of these? But these are themselves, but running the ones through the others, they become now this, now that, and each time are continually similar.
This description of permanence and their cyclic events is extremely similar to the terminology used by Parmenides' poem, where Parmenides argues that the all is one and it didn't come to be, it always just was. Also, the movement and separation of these elementary substances within the sphere reminds me of Genesis 1, verse 6 through 9, where the earth is described as first being formless until the waters were separated by a dome or an expanse by God, gathering the water in the sky in one place and then letting the dry ground disappear. And as we go further into cosmogony, you'll see how that's further reemphasized.
Awesome. And now a little bit about cosmogony and how Empedocles views it. A quick definition of cosmogony involves the study of the origin of the cosmos and or universe and how it all came to be. Cosmogony, according to Empedocles, is the result of the interplay between the four roots, the elements, and the two forces, love and strife, with each root having its own specific nature corresponding to how we even view them today. For example, fire and water are traditionally viewed as antagonistic, whereas fire and air are viewed as compatible. But by adding in the forces love and strife, Empedocles indicates that the specific nature of the roots alone would not be sufficient enough to enable organization of the cosmos. Here we get into inner workings of Empedocles' theory.
So the force love instills attraction within the opposing roots that naturally would not have come together had it not been for love bringing them together into harmony. However, love is also responsible for pulling apart the roots that are similar, but not through the means of repulsion. The goal of strife, on the other hand, is to replace the attraction instilled in opposing roots by love with repulsion. In doing this, strife causes these opposing roots to repel, and thus similar roots come together. Both love and strife are in constant continuation, waxing and waning in strengths from the beginning of the cosmos and its inhabitants, coming into being and then passing away throughout history. So traditionally, Empedocles' section of cosmogony has been viewed as a two-part symmetrical cycle, endlessly repeating itself. Roots united, which is love dominant, and strife enters and begins to separate the roots until fully distinct, which now strife is dominant, and then at which point love re-enters and begins to unite them until fully united. During these half cycles of separation or unification, where one is not dominant of the other, but there's like this middle ground, cosmogony, or the genesis of cosmos, and zoogony, which is the generation of animals, happens. So it's in these middle moments that you have the birth of the cosmos or the birth of the animals. Empedocles describes the stage where love is dominant and the roots are unified and intermingled into a sphere. Here, the sphere is the initial stage in formation of the cosmos, but not the cosmos itself. When strife begins to insinuate itself into the sphere, it results in the separation of the roots into identifiable masses of earth, air, water, and fire in the cosmos, resulting in earth mass at the center of the sphere, water more or less surrounding the earth, air forming the next layer, with fire at the outer edge of the sphere. The ancients recognized this geocentric formation as the representation of our cosmos. And also because it was strife that separated the roots within the sphere, it was believed that cosmogony, as described here, was dependent on the influence of strife.
Strife. Empedocles also describes a time when strife has separated the roots. This separation is total and is the opposite pole from the sphere, which is a total mixture under the influence of love. And a little thing taken from him. When strife has reached the deepest depth of the vortex and love has come to be in the center of the world, under her dominion, all these, the elements, come together to be only one. each one coming from a different place, not brusquely, but willingly.
So this description points to how strife begins separating the roots, which at the beginning is through the means of a vortex, and that the heaviest root settles in the middle, and the lightest root, would be fire, is pushed to the edge of the sphere or the periphery. We kind of see this sometimes when you like centrifuge fluids or whatever, like when
Yes.
you're dealing with blood or whatever in the lab. Just want to insert that.
I think when you
But
mentioned it, that was an example that I used
Yeah.
to try to understand what you were saying, actually. Yeah.
When I started reading that, I was like, oh, it's like when we spin down blood
That's
and you
what
have
I
the
thought.
separation of like the white blood cells, the plasma, and the red blood cells.
Yeah.
Red blood cells being the heavy, right? It is said that the dominance of strife can be characterized by a whirling motion, which is how we've come to know it. This particular piece also describes the ending rule of strife and the re-emergence of love's rule as it begins to insinuate itself back into the elements and roots. So I wanted to kind of expound upon the whole vortex thing. With Empedocles saying that strife begins through the means of a vortex, it calls to mind vortex math. In that, vortex math, just really quickly, an oversimplified definition, is basically a system of numbers explaining the essence of form as a sphere, revealing a spiral line over time. Okay, so the swirling pattern itself represents the flow or vibrational energy of information within the universe that in turn exerts an influence and it is connected to these spiral patterns that we see repeated throughout nature. So kind of like an imprint or a fingerprint of this vortex spiraling through the ether, the cosmos, what have you. On another note, Pythagoras believed that numbers, remember his famous quote is "numbers is all," were the fundamental building blocks of reality and that they held mystical significance reflected in geometrical patterns. So if we put these two together, because Empedocles was said to be a student of Pythagoras, and filter it through the lens of sacred geometry, we get the idea of vortex or vortices that start to signal the possibility of a deeper mystical connection between numbers and the universe. It would then echo that the connections recorded are imprinted as patterns found in nature. And we see this repeated over and over, whether it's a spiral pattern of the Milky Way or hurricanes or something in the plant systems that you see it kind of whirling around. So these interpretations of the cycle formed by alternating ruling forces, whether it's strife or love, is another point of scholarly debate. The description of strife's separation of roots and Empedocles' fragments, first producing cosmos, followed by the complete separation of the roots with no presence of the other to point of suspending all movement, points to the theory that another or a second cosmogony is required to reverse the process, and thus, under the unity of love, the fundamental principle of symmetry is reinforced. So you have this balancing type of image that comes to mind. However, because evidence of Empedocles' description of a second cosmogony has yet to be found in this particular piece or this poem, it is or was traditionally assumed that he didn't support a theory of a second cosmogony, and that he just didn't go that way. Yet in Aristotle's writings, Aristotle strongly argued that Empedocles was committed to a second cosmogony, but that he had yet to theoretically figure out how it happened or how it was to be. So it may be that he didn't write about it, but he believed that there was, he just hadn't come to the point to where he could theoretically talk about it. Despite this, scholars have branded Empedocles' theory as a single cosmogony type theory. And I think it's because it would echo what all the other pre-Socratic philosophers were saying at the time and what they believed. But if we look at the argument that Aristotle makes, it further sets Empedocles and his theories apart from the others, rather than just blended in with the ones at that time. And when you think about it, you know that this is a common thread. Thinkers who have ideas and theories outside the norm bear the fate of either having their ideas or theories blended or, worsely, hardly remembered throughout history at all. So in the case of Empedocles, not only were his ideas and theories blended, but they were hardly discussed. Yet some of those most influential thinkers in history were heavily influenced by Empedocles and echo his philosophies. One such thinker might have been Jesus of Nazareth. And the reason we say this is because the use of the word roots to conceptualize elements or the nature of matter, as used by Empedocles, was also said to have been used by Jesus to describe nature's cyclical coming together and then dissolving, according to the Gnostic texts of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. So here's an excerpt of that. Then will matter be destroyed or not? This was when the apostles were asking Jesus what he had seen and if he could explain more about what he had seen. The Savior said, every nature, every form, every creature exists in and with each other, but they'll dissolve again into their own roots, because the nature of matter dissolves into the nature alone. Anyone who has ears to hear should hear. So going back to the dissolving of nature as being a part of a cycle points to the theory Empedocles was alluding to 500 years prior, potentially, which is part of his second cosmogony theory.
That was really interesting. Empedocles attempted to integrate two opposing views of existence developed by Parmenides and Heraclitus. Parmenides conceived the ultimate existence as a permanent, unchanging being, and Heraclitus, how should I say his name, as ever-changing flow or process. To Empedocles, the Parmenidean view was logically appealing, and the other one was in accord with personal experiences. While Parmenides understood the ultimate reality as homogeneous, permanent and unchanging single entity, Empedocles comprehended it as the combination of the four permanent and unchanging elements. These roots are both material and spiritual. Empedocles' conception of the ultimate reality has intrinsic dynamism, which the Parmenidean concept of the ultimate reality lacked. One thing I will say, even when it comes down to even magic, I mean, when you look at the elements, you will look at them as being in like an earthly form, and then you could look at them as starting to be like spiritual stuff or even like archetypes of thought. So, I mean, do find that interesting how that does kind of carry over still with magic and occultism.
I wonder if it was like what they said earlier, like it was a personification to indicate that it had energy, it had some sort of, sentience to it, so to speak. So that's why it was given like a personality to be identified by. So Empedocles' worldview was that of a cosmic cycle of eternal change, growth and decay, in which the two personified cosmic forces, love and strife, engage in an eternal battle for supremacy. Following similar ethics and psychology of Pythagoras, Empedocles believed in transmigration of souls and vegetarianism. Important to note, his philosophy was influenced by what was being practiced at the time, religious-wise, and other magical practices. Also included in On Nature, Empedocles goes on to explain how the force and combinations of roots exert their influence on zoogony. Humans, plants, and animals went from formless to having a defined form, such as a neck or dual but separate limbs, eyes, sexual reproduction. When I read this, it reminded me of what biology teaches, an event called the Cambrian explosion. And it's a point in time about 540 million years ago, if you adhere to that, right? That all complex life forms suddenly appear in the fossil record. And so it goes from these formless type organisms to all of a sudden a period of rapid evolution where dual but separate limbs appear, compound eyes appear, and sexual reproduction among the different life forms or physiological features of these life forms appear on the planet.
Thank you. And now we'll go on to a little bit of ethics and the journey of the soul. When it comes to ethics and the journey of the soul, Empedocles does speak of daemons and the transmigration of souls. Plutarch cites the following fragment as coming from the beginning of Empedocles' philosophy, and this is considered fragment 115. There is a decree of necessity, ratified long ago by gods, eternal and sealed by broad oaths, that whenever one in error, from fear, defiles his own limbs, having by his error made false the oath he swore, daemons to whom life long lasting is appointed. He wanders from the blessed ones for 3 times countless years, being born throughout the time as all kinds of mortal forms, exchanging one hard way of life for another. For the force of air pursues him into the sea, and the sea spits him out onto the earth's surface. Earth casts him in the rays of the blazing sun, and sun into the eddies of air. One takes him from another, and all abhor him. I too am now one of these, an exile from the gods and a wanderer, having put my trust in raving strife. Traditionally, Plutarch's attribution of this fragment to On Nature was assumed to be incorrect, and it was placed in the Purifications instead. However, from the evidence of the Strasbourg fragments, it seems that it may be Plutarch was correct, since they contain a description of the details of the sin Empedocles accuses himself of. And in fragments, lines 5 through 6, alas, that merciless day did not destroy me sooner, before I devised with my claws terrible deeds for the sake of God. In fragment 115, Empedocles describes himself as a daemon, a being to whom long life has been granted, who has committed the sin of meat-eating and bloodshed, and consequently is punished by banishment from the company of the immortal gods. The banishment lasts 3 myriads of years, either 3 times countless years or 30,000 years. In either case, he must atone for his sin by being repeatedly reincarnated into all the different living forms of the different orders of nature. Fragment 117, elsewhere he says, for before now I have been at some time a boy and a girl, bush, bird, and a mute fish in the sea. Fragment 146, there are others too numbered among the daemons, those who at the end come among men on earth as prophets, minstrels, physicians, and leaders, and from these they arise as gods highest in honor. Now that I actually find that line very impressive, because like he really nailed it for the 2020s. Wow.
Yeah. So relating back to the 30,000 years and this quote that you mentioned, Empedocles is said to have claimed that daemons are not only transient and able to incarnate into plant, animal, and human life, but can remain wandering in these forms for 30,000 seasons. He further goes on to emphasize that this transmigration is a period of exile on earth, of suffering and loss, and hence, therefore, the importance of escape so that the daemon could return to godlike status. These incarnations form a ladder, with the highest order being the laurel and the lion. I think we've heard that somewhere before.
Yes, we have recently, too.
Mm-hmm. This claim of his to being a daemon was more of a reference to being a divine being who was banished, and an almost regression of life by being forced to suffer and endure successive incarnations in a purificatory journey of all the different orders of nature and elements of the cosmos, as you mentioned. But now as human, he believed he had achieved the final and perfect state of nature and would therefore be reborn next as an immortal. Almost like, you have to start off at the bottom at the restaurant and then work your way up to be an owner.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's not clear whether we are meant to imagine the daemons as entirely separate entity, or as people who began as ordinary mortals but having purified themselves and having achieved perfection are now approaching divine status. The latter reading would perhaps make more sense in terms of Empedocles' didactic ethical mission. If we are all potentially perfectible, then his purificatory teaching becomes more crucial. This is often interpreted as a poem focused on the theme of ritual purification, or possibly a poem that contains all his extensive religious and ethical contemplations. Now, we're going to get to psychology, and I wanted to backtrack a little on the quote. Alas, that the pitiless day did not destroy me earlier, which has been referred to as the modified gnomic wisdom of not to be born is best, to make light of Empedocles' transgression of meat eating.
This particular fragment, which has been commonly attributed to on purifications, but is now widely accepted that it comes from on nature, points to the fundamental unity of what has long been looked at as physical and ritual doctrine. Here is where we get a peek into Empedocles' viewing vegetarianism as the antidote to cannibalism or animal eating. Also, on the same fragment, it shows similar stances against bay leaves and beans. Interestingly enough, I don't know if you remember this when we covered Pythagoras, but Pythagoras and his followers, or his cult, were strictly against the consuming of beans because they believed that it contained human souls. So, I don't know. That's kind of interesting.
Didn't we find like other things that thought that too?
Yeah. It's funny because a lot of practices involve cannibalism, right? You hear this a lot. But when I think about cannibalism, I think of Silence of the Lambs when he talks about eating the thymus with a side of fava beans. And I believe fava beans was one of the beans that Empedocles followers did not eat. So It's interesting. Like, is it a nod to that? So,
I find that weird. Mm-hmm. Just like Pythagoras, Empedocles believed in the transmigration of the soul, or metempsychosis, that souls can be reincarnated between humans, animals, and even plants. According to him, all humans, or maybe only a selected few among them, were originally long-lived daemons who dwelt in a state of bliss until committing an unspecified crime, possibly bloodshed or perjury.
As a consequence, they fell to earth, where they would be forced to spend 30,000 cycles of metempsychosis through different bodies before being able to return to the sphere of divinity. So one's behavior during his lifetime would also determine his next incarnation, kind of, I guess, like karma, right? And this cycle of mortal incarnation seems to have been inspired by the god Apollo's punishment as a servant to Admetus.
Never heard of him. And now, onto my one of my favorite parts. I'm sure everybody can tell we're going to get to the eyes now. Empedocles is credited with the first comprehensive theory of light and vision. It is noted that Empedocles suggested that light takes time to pass from one point to another. He put forward the idea that we see objects because light streams out of our eyes and touches them. This became the fundamental basis on which later Greek philosophers and mathematicians like Euclid would construct some of the most important theories of light, vision, and optics. Knowledge is explained by the principle that elements in the things outside us are perceived by the corresponding elements in ourselves. Like is known by like. The whole body is full of pores, and hence respiration takes place over the whole frame. In the organs of sense, these pores are specially adapted to receive the influences which are continually rising from bodies around us. Thus, perception occurs. In vision, certain particles go forth from the eye to meet similar particles given forth from the object, and the resultant contact constitutes vision. Perception is not merely a passive reflection of external objects. Empedocles caused a sensation by explaining how eyesight worked. It was one of the first ideas regarding how human vision works. Empedocles reasoned that the Greek goddess Aphrodite had lit a fire in the eye, and vision was possible because light rays from this fire emanated from the eye, illuminating objects around us. According to Empedocles, the eyes were like a lantern, guiding one through the dark. Sounds familiar. Within each eye blazed a specific kind of fire, this mesmerizing fire of the goddess Aphrodite. Her magical flames burned brightly without ever causing injury or pain, casting forth an inner light that radiated outwards from the eye until it encountered something. And whatever the light touched, you instantly saw with clarity. The inner light projected by your ocular lantern reached around you like delicate sensory tentacles, exploring the world in profound detail. Sight was not merely a passive observation. It was the beautiful consequence of your light connecting with whatever you looked at. And then this is from some stuff that he has. Empedocles focuses on the senses when he talks about the way the eye functions. Just as when someone, before taking the road, constructs a lamp for himself, a flame of gleaming fire in a stormy night, fitting as protection against all winds, lantern casings that scatter the breath of the buffeting winds, while the light, finer as it is, leaping through to the outside, shines on the threshold with its unimpaired beams. Thus, after Aphrodite had fitted the Augean fire enclosed in the membranes with pegs of love, she poured round-eye Cori in filmy veils. These kept off the depth of water flowing around them, but allowed the fire to pass through to the outside, and that it is finer, where they had been bored through the marvelous funnels. Empedocles' theory resonated with many of his fellow Greeks, but not everyone was convinced, and it did raise some questions. One thing that I was thinking of, like even as I was reading this, and even some of the other things that I was just talking about, I have shown it before. I've shown it on the show multiple times, and in all the other podcasts when we're talking about the eye. But back in the eye series, I did show the birth of Venus, and I believe the birth of Venus, which could be interchangeable with Aphrodite, is an artistic depiction of the eyeball, which kind of makes me wonder if Empedocles was doing the same thing with this idea which he's trying to describe with her. And like her dancing could be the hyaloid canal bending or a flame flickering. I wonder if the flame flickering is even a way to, show you that the hyaloid canal could be bending. Another thing I find interesting, Aleister Crowley did develop an order called the Lamp of the Invisible Light, inspired by the Enochian system while he was in Mexico. This was even after his initiation into the Second Order of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn by Mathers, but before his work in either the AA or the OTO. So it was in between that time. But I mean, there's a few things that I do think, in my opinion, Crowley knew who this guy was, and I think he was impressed by his work.
So Plato, who was born not long after Empedocles died, refined his theory to address the concerns raised by others regarding Empedocles. The reason you could not see in a dark room, he explained, was because you needed more than the inner light of your eye lantern to do so. You also had to open the window and let some external light in. External light was made by light sources such as lamp and the sun, which was different. But he's still saying that there's an internal light emanating through, right? In the time of Timaeus, Plato wrote that eyes emanated a substance akin to the light of everyday life that flowed in a stream smooth and dense. By itself, this stream of vision was inert, but the catalytic light of an external and kindred fire transformed it. It could then diffuse the motions of whatever it touched, causing the perception which we call sight. Plato used his optical model to explain how you saw your face in the mirror. You saw your face because of the interplay between the internal light from your eye, some external light, and a third kind of light being given off spontaneously by your face. Sight happened when your vision stream ran into the light being given off by the objects you were looking at. Your vision stream smacked into the light coming off of your face precisely on the surface of the mirror. And on that surface, you would then see your face.
Thank you. Some things, as we're getting ready to wrap this up, just, one thing I did want to kind of add to on nature and on purifications. And this really could be a jump, but I do wonder if like we could be looking at the optic nerve nature or the optic nerve purifications. And I can't help to but also think of the OTO Minerval initiation, and the word that you were giving during that initiation is also on. It is my opinion, in that situation, it is representing the optic nerve. Especially when you're standing in front of a tent that looks like the optic nerve with the retina vein or artery that runs right up it. You see that too. And another thing to even add, and not to say too much, but like you will get your thumb pumped 12 times while you're standing over there. And the optic nerve is also one of the 12 cranial nerves. When you're looking at the eye, you can see where the eye splits from the vitreous humor to the aqueous humor, and where the lens and the ora serrata are. And when you're looking at that part of the eye, as silly as it sounds, it can start to look like stuff in nature, like an upside down flower petal or a seashell, or then you can start seeing trees in there. So, it's just like a little thing that I was really wondering about with that whole thing. I know it's a little out there. It's a little bit for you to think about with that one. But, yeah. Basically, we're pretty much done with talking about the man. There is a few fragments here that I would like to read off, and then we will wrap it up. So here's some of them that I just thought were rather interesting to hear. More will I tell thee too. There is no birth of all things mortal, nor end in ruinous death, but mingling only and in interchange of mixed. There is, and birth is, but its name with men. I just find that interesting. It's basically saying to me, there's no birth or no death.
Which is interesting because in the Gnostic text of Mary Magdalene, Jesus talks about not dying.
Yeah. Kind of like, we were saying that earlier. Pretty much the energy isn't destroyed.
Right.
Though it protect from breath of blowing winds, its beam darts outward as more fine and thin, and with untiring rays lights up the sky. Just so the fire, primeval, once lay hid in the round pupil of the eye, enclosed in films and gauzy veils, which through and through were pierced with pores divinely fashioned, and thus kept off the watery deeps around, while fire burst outward as more fine and thin. I'm assuming, that does really sound a lot like how he's describing how he thinks the eyeballs work. Mm-hmm. So, wanted to throw that in. And one thing I did find interesting is that, I don't know if these fragments are actually, the way they're numbered in the book, but, from what I just read, it was from 84 to 88. And I just always find those numbers very interesting. Now, let me continue reading. The gentle flame of eye did chance to get only a little of the earthen part, from which by Aphrodite the divine, the untiring eyes were formed. Thus Aphrodite wrought with bolts of love. One vision of two eyes is born. I don't know, I liked all of that. I thought that was pretty interesting, and I thought it was just other ways to include some of his fragment pieces talking about the eyes and Aphrodite. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's all I got.
I think I read somewhere, I'm going to summarize what I guess I read, that kind of captures exactly, I think, who Empedocles was, or what we're trying to portray Empedocles as. His poetry played a significant role in creating the separate fields of astronomy, biology, chemistry, cosmology, medicine, philosophy, psychology, and rhetoric. He was considered a sorcerer whose words had a magical power that did and continues to bewitch the brightest of minds. He was a healer who specialized in ecstasy and had the ability to access other states of consciousness at will. It is said that Empedocles had come to realize his immortality by discovering his divinity. He went on to record his teachings in the form of poetry, which have been considered as a powerful way to direct people towards experiencing their own divine nature, freeing people of the illusions that bind them and bring them to an immediate awareness of their own immortal soul.
Well said, Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much. I really think this was a...
Thank you.
As you can see, there will be no part 2, even though I said it will be a part. This 2-part series. I honestly thought 27 pages of notes was going to take 2 shows. So, but when you make it 14, what is that again?
14 font.
Yeah, the 14 font, because I can't see it. I guess you make it look a little bit longer than it really was. But that was an awesome episode. Thank you so much, Lisa, for doing this with me. This was really an amazing.
Thank you for being patient about it.
No. Thank you for doing it with me. I really appreciate it. There was tons of work in there. And again, like you said at the end, this man, we both think he was highly influential in so many people in science with sight. This guy was from back for 500 BC. I mean, another thing I just even want to add, it's just, not for nothing, but when you start looking at people that had huge impacts in the way we view the world today, it seems like an occultist seems to pop up quite often.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's something to think about, in my opinion.
For sure.
Yeah, but again, thank you, Lisa, so much for finally we got Empedocles done and we killed it. And I really think that was, not to brag or to pat ourselves on the back, but this is going to be probably the longest and most comprehensive work done on this man that you're going to find on YouTube and probably podcasts.
Yes,
probably. For sure. We scoured it. I don't think we saw anything over 38 minutes, and everything was pretty much the same thing. So
yes.
I'm really hoping that people get something out of this and that they will look into the man's work. Because I think it's very important to know who he is. And again, like Lisa said at the beginning of the show, how many times was this guy always coming up when we were looking at other people? He influenced a lot of occultists and alchemists and scientists.
Absolutely.
So, all right. That is the end of another amazing, I'm just going to say it myself, another amazing Occult Rejects episode. And thank you very much, Lisa. And thank you everybody for listening. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.